The atmosphere inside the great atrium of the ether spire did not just feel heavy, it felt viscous, like breathing through liquid mercury. High Mentor Zektor stood upon the obsidian dais, his 7 optical sensors rotating with a mechanical whirring sound that set everyone's nerves on edge. Behind him, the panoramic reinforced transparent hull offered a view of the void bleed, a jagged, pulsing tear in the fabric of the stars that bled a bruised, electric violet light. It was a wound in reality that refused to scar over, and today it seemed to be beating in time with the racing hearts of 300 cadets. Asymmetrical warfare is not about the size of your fleet, Zektor's voice rasped, vibrating through the translation collars of 50 different species. It is about the integrity of the link. If your synaptic lattice fails, you are not just a soldier who lost a fight. You are a biological casualty waiting to happen. The mentor tapped a command onto the holographic interface, and the names of the graduating class began to scroll in shimmering amber letters. This was the moment of the lattice bonding, the final assignment that dictated whether a student became a guardian of the frontiers or a technician in the lower muckhouses. In the ether spire, you did not graduate alone. You were paired by an algorithm calculated to 99% accuracy, a bond that shared pain, adrenaline, and every flickering thought. At the very front row sat Princess Syra. Her silver hair was bound in intricate braids, and her lunari features, the subtle feline slant of her eyes and the velvet tufts at the tips of her ears, were frozen in a mask of regal indifference. She was the crown mind, the highest-rated psychic talent the Spire had seen in 3 centuries. Next to her sat Varkas Krell, a Thraxian warrior whose obsidian skin reflected the violet glare of the void. He was already grinning, his 4 hands resting on his knees, a predator who knew he was about to be paired with the ultimate prize. But in the very back row, where the shadows of the structural pillars pooled like ink, sat Kalen Voss. Kalen was a ghost in a room full of monsters. He was slight, his human frame swallowed by the oversized gray fatigues of the academy. While others checked their data pads or adjusted their armor, Kalen simply stared at the floor. He did not take notes. He did not speak. He sat with a stillness so profound it felt like a vacancy in space. To the rest of the class, he was a bottom feeder, a scholarship student from a dead mining colony whose survival rating was barely above 0. The algorithm has completed its assessment, Zektor announced, his sensors fixing on the front row. Princess Syra of the Lunari stepped forward. Syra rose with a grace that made the other cadets look like stumbling ore crushers. She walked to the center of the dais, the light of the void bleed washing over her silver skin. The amber hologram shifted, preparing to display the name of her calculated partner. Everyone expected to see Varkas Krell. It was the only logical choice, the strategist and the hammer. The name appeared, Varkas Krell. A ripple of approval went through the hall. Varkas stood up, his heavy boots clanking against the metal floor. "Copy that, mentor," he barked, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "Let's get this show on the road." Syra did not move. She did not look at Varkas. Instead, she reached out and tapped the holographic screen. With a sharp, crystalline flick of her wrist, she swiped Varkas's name into the trash bin of the interface. The room went dead silent. Even the hum of the air recyclers seemed to pause. "The algorithm is a suggestion," Syra said, her voice melodic but carrying the weight of a heavy-caliber railgun. "I require a partner who understands the silence, not one who drowns it out with his own ego." She turned away from the dais and began to walk. She did not walk toward the elite warriors or the high IQ changelings. She began to climb the tiered steps toward the back of the room. Her boots clicked rhythmically, a sharp, steady sound that echoed like a countdown. Every head turned. Varkas's obsidian face twisted into a snarl of pure confusion, his 4 hands clenching into fists. Syra reached the shadowed back row. She stopped in front of the slight, pale human who hadn't even looked up yet. "You," Syra said, her emerald eyes burning with an intensity that could melt hull plating. "Stand up." Kalen Voss slowly lifted his head. His eyes were a weary, washed-out gray, encircled by the dark shadows of a man who hadn't slept in a decade. He looked at the princess, then at the 300 stunned aliens watching them. He didn't look honored. He didn't look excited. He looked like she had just handed him a death sentence. Princess, Kalen whispered, his voice dry and thin. You're making a tactical error. I'm not just a low-tier cadet. I'm a liability. I am counting on it, Sierra replied. For 10 seconds, the great atrium was a vacuum of sound. Then a strange noise filled the room, a rustling of fabric and the clatter of weapons. Mentor Zektor watched in disbelief as the top-tier cadets, including Varkas, slowly bowed their heads. It was not a bow of respect for a royal. It was the carrion's salute, the gesture a predator makes when it sees a prey animal walk voluntarily into a slaughter pen. They were acknowledging a dead man. By choosing the silent, weak human, Syra had effectively painted a target on Kalen's back and rung the dinner bell for every ambitious cadet in the spire. Accept the link, Voss, Zektor barked, his sensors twitching with irritation. Or pack your gear and bug out. Kalen sighed. It was the sound of a man who had spent his whole life trying to be invisible and had failed spectacularly. He stood up, and as he did, his sleeve rode up his right arm. For a brief second, Syra saw it, a jagged white scar running from his wrist to his elbow, the telltale burn of a rejected synaptic lattice from a previous catastrophic attempt. Interesting, Syra murmured, though her internal pulse quickened. I'm telling you, Kalen said as he stepped toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. When this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you. My head is a crowded place, Syra. Then it's a good thing I brought a map, she retorted. As they walked down the aisle together, the silver lioness and the gray ghost, the void bleed outside flared with a sudden, violent spike of luminosity. It was as if the universe itself was reacting to the pairing, a pulse of light so bright it cast long, sharp shadows across the lecture hall. Zektor watched the telemetry on his private screen. The resonance frequency between the two of them wasn't just high, it was off the charts. It wasn't a harmony, it was a collision. May the stars have mercy on us all, the mentor whispered. The medical wing of the ether spire smelled of ozone, sterile gel, and the copper tang of blood. It was a place where biology was stripped down to its rawest components. Kalen sat on the edge of a cold white biobed, his hands resting on his knees. Across from him, Syra stood with her arms crossed, watching as high chirurgeon Vexen, a fluid state being whose body shifted between translucent blue and deep indigo, prepared the injectors. This is not a training wheel, Link, Vexen said, his voice bubbling like a submerged engine. The synaptic lattice is a permanent subdermal cortex tap. It weaves into the base of your skull. It shares proprioception, pain, and adrenal spikes. There is no off switch, Princess. If your partner feels a needle, you feel a knife. If his heart stops, your brain will think yours has too. Do it, Sierra commanded. We're burning daylight. Kalen looked up, his gray eyes fixing on Vexen's shifting form. One condition, he said. The princess tilted her head. You're in no position to bargain, Voss. No mind games, Kalen insisted, his voice gaining a sudden, hard edge. The lattice shares sensory data and tactical instinct. It doesn't give you the right to dig through my memories just because you're bored or suspicious. You stay in your room, I stay in mine. If you try to pry, I will shut down. I'll turn into a brick, and you'll fail the semester. Sierra narrowed her eyes. She was used to subjects who bowed, not partners who drew lines in the sand. But beneath his weariness, she saw a bedrock of resolve. He wasn't joking. Agreed, she said. I have no interest in the clutter of a human mind anyway. Vexen moved in, initiating sync in 3, 2, 1. 2. The sensation wasn't like a needle. It was like a lightning strike that bypassed the skin and hit the soul. Kalen's back arched involuntarily, his breath catching in a silent scream. For a split second, he wasn't in the medical wing. He was running through a frozen forest on Lunaris 4, smelling the crisp scent of pine and the metallic tang of a coming storm. He felt the power of muscles he didn't own, the twitch of a tail he didn't possess, and a burning, jagged hole of grief in his chest that screamed for a brother who was never coming back. Sierra, conversely, slumped forward. She felt a sudden, crushing weight. It wasn't physical, it was the weight of silence. She felt a profound exhaustion, a wall of gray static that dampened her fiery senses. It felt like standing in a bunker while a war raged outside. The vibrant colors of the room faded into shades of gray, and the frantic pace of her thoughts slowed to a rhythmic, heavy crawl. Then the connection stabilized. The feedback loop settled into a low, vibrating hum at the base of their skulls. "By the void," Syra whispered, staring at Kalen with a new, unsettled expression. "Is this what it feels like to be you? It's so heavy. It's like gravity is twice as strong in your head." "You get used to the weight," Kalen said, rubbing the back of his neck where the silver port now shimmered. "It's better than the alternative." They didn't have time to process the intimacy of the link. The intercom crackled with Sector's gravelly voice. "All bonded pairs report to Sector 9 Delta. Trial 1 commences in 20 minutes. This is a live fire simulation. Failure to synchronize will result in immediate disqualification. And cadets, watch your 6. The void bleed is hungry today." As they walked through the corridors toward the simulation bays, the shared sensations were overwhelming. Syra could feel Kalen's slight limp from an old injury. Kalen could feel the way Syra's skin prickled with the cold air. They moved in perfect step, their strides subconsciously matching, a side effect of the fresh lattice. They were met at the entrance by Varkas Krell and his new partner, a nervous-looking avian cadet named Kiri. Varkas blocked the doorway, his forearms folded across his massive chest. "Nice pet you found there, Princess," Varkas sneered. "Does it know how to fetch, or does it just sit there and look pathetic? I'm looking forward to seeing how much of his pain you can take before you beg the mentor to cut the cord." "He isn't a pet, Varkas," Syra said, her voice dropping an octave. "He's a partner, and if I were you, I'd worry more about your own synchronization. I can feel your heart rate from here. You're overclocking. You'll burn your partner out before the first objective." Varkas flushed a deep purple. "We'll see who burns first." They entered the simulation bay, a massive, spherical arena filled with floating debris, rotating walls, and absolute darkness. The objective was simple: reach the beacon at the center. The obstacle: the other teams were allowed to use any non-lethal means to stop them. Kalen and Syra floated at the starting gate, their mag boots locked to the platform. The darkness was absolute, lit only by the faint heads-up displays in their visors. "Strategy?" Syra asked over the comms, her voice tight with adrenaline. "I'll take point. I can use my kinetic pulse to clear the debris. You stay behind me and cover the blind spots." "No," Kalen said. Syra turned her helmet toward him, her annoyance flaring through the lattice like a hot spark. "Excuse me? If you use kinetic pulses, you'll light us up like a flare on their sensors," Kalen explained, his voice calm, almost boring. "Varkas's species hunts by thermal plumes and movement. We'll be zeroed in within 30 seconds. You're the top duelist in the Spire, Syra, but you're used to fighting with an audience. Out here, the audience wants to kill you." "And what do you suggest, human?" she snapped. "Lights off," Kalen commanded. "We ghost it." "But I can't see." "You don't need to see," Kalen thought back, the intent flowing through the lattice with surprising clarity. "You have my ears, and I can hear the heartbeat of this room." He reached into his suit's utility interface and activated the external speakers, not for music, but for something far more subtle. He began to play a looped audio file of low-frequency white noise. To a human, it was nothing. To the sensitive ears of the other alien species in the room, it was like a thick fog. "Now," Kalen whispered. "Step when I step. Breathe when I breathe." They pushed off into the void. Instead of a frantic dash, they moved with a slow, agonizing patience. Kalen used the debris as shields, drifting behind rotating plates of scrap metal. Through the link, Syra felt his focus. It wasn't the sharp, jagged focus of a warrior. It was the deep, rhythmic focus of a predator that had all the time in the world. She felt a sudden tug in her mind. Kalen's warning. 30 meters to the left, Varkas was moving. She could hear the heavy thud of his thrusters, the arrogant display of power. He was clearing a path with raw force, exactly as Kalen had predicted. "He's baiting us," Syra realized. "He's hungry," Kalen corrected, "and hungry things make mistakes." They reached the midpoint of the arena. The beacon was visible now, a pulsing blue light behind a heavy mesh of electrified wires. But standing between them and the goal was Varkas. his heavy repeater cannon leveled at the only entrance. "I know you're in here, princess," Varkas roared over the open channel. "I can smell the human's fear. Come out and take your medicine." Syra felt her anger rising. She wanted to charge, to show this brute the true power of a Lunari crown mind. Her hand moved toward her kinetic gauntlet. "Steady," Kalen's voice echoed in her head. It was like a cool hand on a fevered brow. "Don't give him what he wants. We're going to use the back door." "What back door? This is a sealed arena." Kalen drifted toward a massive ventilation intake for the arena's atmospheric processors. He pulled out a small multi-tool and began to unscrew the casing. "This is a maintenance hatch," Kalen said. "It's not on the tactical maps because the faculty thinks no one is small enough to fit through the fan blades." "We aren't," Sira hissed. "Those blades are spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute." "They are if the power is on," Kalen said. He jammed his multi-tool into the junction box. Through the lattice, Syra felt a surge of technical intuition. Kalen wasn't just guessing. He was reading the electrical flow of the station like a poem. 3, 2, 1, now. The massive fan groaned and slowed to a halt. Kalen slipped through the blades, pulling Syra after him. They crawled through a narrow, dark duct that smelled of grease and old dust. It was cramped, suffocating, and terrifying. Syra felt Kalen's heart rate. It remained a steady 60 beats per minute. "How are you so calm?" she whispered. "Because I've spent 20 years in a box smaller than this," Kalen replied. "This is luxury." They emerged directly behind the beacon. Varkas was still facing the other way, firing blind into the darkness, screaming taunts into the void. Kalen reached out and tapped the blue sphere. "Winner, Team Lunari Voss." The lights flooded the arena. Varkas froze, his repeater cannon still smoking. He turned around, his obsidian face contorting with a rage so pure it felt like a physical heat. "Cheaters!" Varkas bellowed. "They used the vents. Mentor, that's a violation of the combat protocol." Zektor's hologram appeared in the center of the room. "The protocol states you must reach the beacon by any means available within the simulation parameters," the mentor said, his sensors fixed on Kalen. "Cadet Voss used the architecture." "That is not cheating, Varkas. That is intelligence, a concept you seem to be struggling with." Syra unlatched her helmet, her silver hair spilling out. She looked at Kalen, who was already leaning against a piece of debris, looking like he wanted to take a nap. "You," Syra said, her voice shaking slightly with the leftover adrenaline. "You're not a liability. You're a ghost in the machine." Kalen just shrugged. "I'm just a guy who wants to graduate, princess. Don't make it a thing." But as they walked out of the arena, Syra felt something through the lattice that Kalen couldn't hide. It was a flicker of memory, a vision of a burning colony, a scream of 1,000 voices, and the same cold, heavy silence he used as a shield. She realized then that Kalen Voss wasn't just quiet. He was a survivor of something that should have killed him. And for the first time in her life, Princess Syra felt a genuine spark of fear, not of her enemies, but of the man she had just tethered to her soul. The silence in the private recovery suite was not empty. To Kalen Voss, silence was a physical thing, a thick, insulating layer of wool that he wrapped around his consciousness to keep the screaming of the universe at bay. But now, with the synaptic lattice stitched into the base of his skull, the wool was full of holes. He could feel Princess Syra, even though she was standing 5 meters away by the observation window. He could feel her restless energy, a shimmering golden frequency that tasted like citrus and sharp metal. It was intrusive. It was loud. "Why did you do it, Syra?" Kalen asked without turning around. He was sitting on a high-density foam block, his back to her. The silver port at his neck was still raw, the skin around it a faint, bruised violet. He didn't use her title. In the lattice, titles were just more noise, more friction. Syra turned, her silver hair catching the flickering light of the void bleed outside. She looked at him with an intensity that would have made a Thraxian warrior blink. "I told you, I needed someone who understands the silence. Varkas Krell is a loudmouth grunt who thinks every problem can be solved with a kinetic hammer. He would have drowned me out." Kalen let out a short, dry laugh. "You didn't answer the question. You're a Lunari royal. Your people are the crown minds of the convergence. You could have had anyone. You could have picked a strategist from the high command or a psych warrior from the inner sanctum. Instead, you picked a human who failed hand-to-hand combat because he apologized to the training dummy. I felt your mind during the selection ceremony, Cyrus said, walking toward him. Her boots made no sound on the deck, but he felt the vibration of her intent through the link. It wasn't empty, Kalen. It was walled off. You weren't sitting in the back row because you were afraid. You were sitting there because you were hiding. Kalen stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He finally looked at her. I'm a suture, Syra. The word hung in the air like a cold mist. Syra froze, her emerald eyes widening. The Lunari knew the legends. They knew the ancient texts that spoke of the suture, the rare neurological mutation among humans that allowed them to absorb the psychic fallout of the void. But there hadn't been a recorded suture in over 300 years. They were considered a genetic dead end, a biological anomaly that had been bred out of existence. You're joking, she whispered, her voice losing its regal edge. Kalen walked to the window, staring out at the violet tear in space. My colony, Calum Minor, sat right on the edge of a minor rift. When I was 5 years old, the stabilizers failed. Every other human on that rock went mad within 6 hours. Their brains literally cooked in their own adrenaline. I was the only one who didn't scream. I just sat there and listened to the rift. I heard it, Syra. I heard the sound of the universe breaking. He turned back to her, and for the first time, he let the barrier in his mind drop just a fraction. Through the lattice, Syra was hit by a wave of sensory input so vast it nearly knocked her off her feet. It wasn't a thought, it was a roar. She heard the distant hum of the Ether Spire's engines, the rhythmic breathing of every cadet in the barracks, the crackle of static from the void bleed. And beneath it all, a low, mournful cello note that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. Make it stop, Syra gasped, clutching her head. Kalen slammed the wall back up. The roar vanished, replaced by the heavy, dull silence. That's what it's like to be me, he said, his voice flat. I'm a living sponge for every psychic vibration in a 10-light-year radius. I have to be boring. I have to be silent. Because if I feel too much, if I let the world in, the suture opens. And once it opens, it doesn't just absorb the noise, it feeds on it. Syra regained her composure, though she was still trembling. My father, the High King, he sent me a message. He said he fits. He didn't mean you were a good match for me as a partner. He meant you were a component. Kalen nodded, a bitter smile touching his lips. The Ether Spire isn't just a school, Syra. It's an archaeological site. This station was built by the precursors to guard the Void Bleed. And the legend says it takes a crown mind to steer the station's weapons, but it takes a suture to anchor them. Your father didn't send you here to graduate. He sent you here to find the key to a machine that hasn't been turned on in 1,000 years. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't a princess. She was a pilot. And Kalen wasn't her partner. He was the dampener. Everything she had worked for, the years of training, the perfect scores, the grief for her fallen brother, it was all a setup for a destiny she hadn't chosen. They're using us, Syra whispered. They've been using us since the day we were born, Kalen replied. But here's the thing about being a component, Syra. If the component refuses to click into place, the machine doesn't work. He walked past her toward the door. We have another trial at 6 in the evening. I suggest you get some rack time, Princess. If we're going to be the keys to the universe, we should probably at least look like we know what we're doing. Kalen? Syra called out. He stopped, his hand on the door sensor. Why did you tell me? You could have kept the wall up. Kalen didn't look back. Because in the lattice, you felt my fear, and I felt your loneliness. If we're going to die for a cause we didn't choose, we might as well do it with our eyes open. Solid? Syra took a deep breath, the citrus taste of her energy turning into something cooler, more grounded. Solid, Kalen. As the door hissed shut, Kalen walked down the dimly lit corridor of the residential wing. He was tired, but the noise in his head wouldn't stop. He could feel the eyes of the other cadets on him, even through the walls. He was no longer the invisible boy. He was the anomaly. And in a station full of warriors, anomalies were either worshipped or dissected. He rounded a corner and nearly collided with Archon Malcor. The Archon was a tall, skeletal figure from a species that had long ago traded flesh for cybernetics. His skin was a dull, polished chrome, and his eyes were glowing red orbs that seemed to record everything they saw. He was a diplomat by title, but everyone in the Spire knew he was the voice of the Convergence's dark interests. Cadet Voss, Malcor said, his voice a series of modulated electronic tones. A fascinating performance in the arena today. To use the ventilation shafts, such a human solution. Practical. Gritty. Just trying to survive, Archon, Kalen said, trying to step around him. Survival is a low bar, Voss, Malcor said, blocking his path with a spindly, metallic arm. You possess a unique frequency. The void bleed responds to you. I wonder, do you ever feel the urge to stop listening and start talking back? I'm a quiet guy, Archon. I don't have much to say to the void. Malcor leaned in, the whirring of his internal servos loud in the quiet hallway. The Convergence is preparing for a new era. The void bleed is not a wound, boy. It is a doorway, and doorways need keys. If the princess proves to be difficult, I hope you remember that a suture can find a better home than a failing station. Are you offering me a job, Archon? Because I should warn you, my dental plan is very expensive. Malcor's red eyes flickered. Humor is a common defense mechanism for your species, but in the dark, humor doesn't provide much light. Think on it, Voss. The gauntlet is only beginning. Kalen watched the Archon stride away, his metallic footsteps ringing like a funeral bell. The threat was clear. Malcor knew what he was, and if Malcor knew, then the shadow ham joy lurking on the edge of the sector wasn't there for a resupply. Kalen reached his quarters and collapsed onto the bunk. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat in the dark, breathing in the cold air. Through the lattice, he felt Syra fall into a fitful sleep. He felt her dreams, a blur of silver snow and the sound of a ship exploding. He reached out through the link, not prying, just offering a steady, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat. Slow down, Syra, he thought, just for 5 minutes. Breathe with me. Gradually, her mental frequency stabilized. The citrus turned into a soft, lavender hue. Kalen closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold bulkhead. He was terrified. Every instinct told him to bug out, to find a shuttle and disappear into the outer rim. But as he felt Sarah's presence, he realized for the first time that his silence wasn't a prison, it was a shelter. And for the first time in 20 years, someone else was inside it with him. He wasn't just a component, he was a partner. And that, he realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. The second trial was not held in the clean, controlled environment of the simulation bays. Instead, Mentor Zektor led the 20 remaining pairs down to Sector 12, a place known to the cadets as the scrapyard. It was a massive, depressurized hangar that had been partially destroyed during a pirate raid 60 years ago. Jagged girders hung from the ceiling like frozen lightning, and the floor was a treacherous landscape of frozen coolant, shattered glass, and the rusted hulls of ancient starfighters. The panoramic view here was terrifying. There was no reinforced glass, only a shimmering, gold-tinted containment field that separated the hangar from the vacuum of space and the roaring violet heart of the void bleed. Listen up, shell walkers. Zektor's voice boomed through their suit comms. Today's lesson is about environmental awareness. You are capped at 10% oxygen. Your mag boots are slave to a randomized cycle, and the hangar is filled with psycho-reactive drones that track your adrenal output. If you panic, they get faster. If you fight, they get stronger. Your objective is the data core at the far end of the hangar. Move! Kalen felt Syra's heart rate spike through the lattice. It was a sharp, jagged needle of light in his mind. The oxygen restriction was already playing with her head. Calm down, Syra, Kalen said, his voice a steady hum in her helmet. 10% is more than enough if you don't waste it on panting. Easy for you to say, she snapped back, though he felt her effort to slow her breathing. My species needs twice the intake of a human. This feels like breathing through a straw. Then let me carry the load, Kalen said. He adjusted the lattice settings, a delicate maneuver that allowed him to absorb some of her physiological stress. It felt like a hot iron being pressed against his spine, but he didn't flinch. Through the link, he felt Syra's panic recede. The straw became a pipe. Better? She exhaled, a long, shaky sound. Better. You're a freak, Voss. You know that, right? I've been told. Now, eyes on. Varkas is moving. Across the hangar, Varkas Krell and his partner, Kiri, were already halfway to the first cover point. Varkas was moving like a landslide, his forearms using jagged beams to pull himself forward, while Kiri fluttered behind him, her avian wings useless in the vacuum, but her talons providing extra grip on the ice. They were fast, but they were loud. The first drone emerged from the shadows of a derelict freighter. It was a sleek, silver sphere with a single red eye, its surface rippling as it analyzed the adrenal signatures in the room. It locked onto Varkas instantly. "Contact!" Kiri screamed over the general channel. Varkas didn't hesitate. He drew a heavy kinetic pistol and fired. The slug hit the drone, but instead of shattering, the drone absorbed the impact. It grew larger, its red eye turning a brilliant, angry orange. It let out a high-pitched screech that vibrated through the cadets' suits. "Stupid grunt," Sarah muttered. "He's feeding it." Kalen watched as 3 more drones materialized, drawn by the violence of the exchange. They began to circle Varkas's team like sharks. "We're not going around them," Kalen said. "Why not?" Syra asked. "We can slip past while they're busy being target practice. Because Varkas is going to blow a hole in the containment field if he keeps using that rail pistol," Kalen analyzed, his eyes scanning the structural integrity of the hangar. "Look at the support pillar behind him. It's already cracked. If that field drops, we're all going for a long walk in a short vacuum." Kalen pushed off from their starting platform, his movements fluid and economical. He didn't use his thrusters. He used the debris, drifting from one shadow to the next. Syra followed, her movements mirroring his through the lattice. They were like 2 ghosts moving through a graveyard. They reached the central cluster of wreckage, just 10 meters from where Varkas was currently wrestling with 2 drones. The Thraxian was roaring, his 4 fists striking the metal spheres with enough force to dent hull plating. But for every blow he landed, the drones became more aggressive. "Varkas!" Kalen shouted over the comms. "Cease fire! You're overclocking the sensors. Get bent, human!" Varkas yelled back, "I'll scrap these gearheads myself." Kalen looked at Syrah. "I need a distraction, not a big one, just enough to reset their logic gates." Sarah smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. "I can do that." She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached into the lattice. Kalen felt her focus shift, the golden frequency of her mind tightening into a needle-thin beam. She projected a burst of pure, unadulterated boredom. It was a psychic frequency that tasted like stagnant water and gray dust. The drones paused. Their red eyes flickered. To their sensors, the area around Syra and Kalen had suddenly become a void of interest. They turned their attention back to Varkas, whose rage was still a bright, tempting bonfire. Now, Kalen thought. He lunged forward, not toward the drones, but toward the support pillar. He jammed his multi-tool into the emergency override panel. His fingers moved with a blur of speed, bypassing the security locks. He wasn't hacking the station. He was talking to it. He could feel the pulse of the Ether Spire's central AI, a vast cold intelligence that was currently being jammed by the void bleed. "Come on, old girl," Kalen whispered. "Just give me 5 seconds of manual control." The panel beeped. A holographic interface appeared, showing the hangar's environmental settings. Kalen didn't turn up the oxygen. He didn't fix the gravity. He vented the fire suppression foam. A massive cloud of thick white chemical foam erupted from the ceiling, instantly coating everything in Sector 12. It was a non-toxic, high-viscosity substance designed to smother electrical fires. In the vacuum of the hangar, it expanded into a blinding white fog. The drones went haywire. Their visual and thermal sensors were useless in the thick, opaque foam. They began to spin in circles, their red eyes flashing erratically as they lost their lock on Varkas. "Move!" Kalen signaled. He and Syra used the foam as a physical guide, sliding along the slick floor. Through the lattice, their connection was the only thing that kept them oriented. Syra could feel Kalen's spatial awareness. It was like a 3-dimensional map projected directly into her brain. She saw the debris, the gaps in the drones without even opening her eyes. They reached the data core at the far end of the hangar. Kalen slapped his palm onto the sensor. Objective secured. Team Lunarivos. The foam suppression system deactivated, and the hangar's air recyclers began to groan as they sucked the white fog out of the room. As the air cleared, the 20 pairs of cadets were revealed. Most were tangled in debris or struggling to stand on the slippery floor. Varkas Krell was buried under a pile of foam, his forearms flailing in frustration as he tried to wipe the chemicals off his visor. Zektor's voice came over the comms, and for the first time, there was a hint of something other than gravel in his tone. It was pride. Unorthodox, Voss. Most cadets try to outrun the drones. You decided to blind the room. If you can't change the player, change the board, mentor, Kalen said, his voice sounding small in the vast hangar. The trial ended, but as the cadets began to head back to the airlock, the station suddenly shuddered. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the void bleed. It was a sharp, violent impact that made the metal floor groan and buckle. The containment field at the end of the hangar flickered. A jagged crack appeared in the shimmering gold light. Proximity alert! A synthetic voice screamed over the PA system. Structural breach in Sector 12. All personnel evacuate immediately. Kalen looked toward the containment field. A small black ship, no larger than a shuttle but bristling with weapons, had slammed into the outer hull. It wasn't a pirate vessel. It bore the crest of the Archon's personal guard. They're not waiting for the gauntlet, Syra realized, her voice trembling in Kalen's head. They're taking the station now. The breach expanded. The gold field hissed as it tried to fight back the vacuum. A group of heavily armored mercenaries in environment suits began to pour through the hole, their pulse rifles raised. They weren't shooting at the cadets. They were shooting at the sensors, blinding the Mentor's observation deck. Varkas, Kalen yelled, pointing at the mercenaries. Use that repeater. Now. Varkas didn't argue. The Thraxian stood his ground, his forearms steadying the heavy kinetic cannon. He opened fire, the slugs tearing through the metal crates where the mercenaries were trying to take cover. Syra, we have to get to the data core, Kalen said, grabbing her arm. They're not here for us yet. They're here to wipe the pairing records. They want to make sure the Convergence doesn't know who the suture is. Why? Because if I'm dead, the loom stays closed, Kalen said. And if the loom stays closed, Malcor can use the void bleed as a permanent weapon. They ran toward the core, but a mercenary stepped out from behind a fallen girder, his rifle leveled at Kalen's chest. The man was a human, his face obscured by a dark visor. Target located, the mercenary said over a local channel. Terminating. Kalen froze. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a shield. He felt the cold, hard reality of death approaching. Through the lattice, he felt a sudden, violent surge of energy. It wasn't his. It was Syra's. She didn't use a kinetic gauntlet. She didn't use a physical strike. She grabbed Kalen's mind and pulled. She used his suture mutation like a lens, focusing all the psychic noise of the dying hangar, all the fear of the trapped cadets, and all the screaming of the void bleed into a single devastating point. She didn't shoot the mercenary. She broke his mind. The man let out a wet, gurgling sound and collapsed, blood leaking from beneath his visor. His rifle clattered to the floor. Syra stood there, her eyes glowing a brilliant, terrifying white. She was gasping for air, her silver hair whipping around her face as if caught in a psychic wind. What? What did I just do? She whispered. You didn't just use the lattice, Kalen said, catching her before she fell. You used me. You used the silence to amplify the noise. He looked at the fallen mercenary, then at the chaos of the hangar. The other cadets were fighting back now, led by Zektor, who had descended from the observation deck with a heavy riot staff. The mercenaries were being pushed back toward their ship, but the damage was done. The hangar was a ruin, and the secret was out. Kalen pulled Syra toward the airlock. We have to go. Malcor won't stop with a single squad. He'll vent the whole station if he has to. As they reached the safety of the inner decks, Kalen felt a new sensation through the link. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, aching sadness. Syra was looking at her hands, the hands that had just extinguished a life without even touching it. I didn't want to be a killer, Kalen, she thought. We're not killers, Syra, Kalen thought back, his heartbeat steadying hers. We're survivors, and sometimes surviving is the hardest job there is. They reached their quarters. But the station felt different now. The walls felt thinner. The shadows felt longer. Through the lattice, Kalen felt the void bleed outside. It was no longer a distant hum. It was a call. It was waiting for them. And for the first time in his life, Kalen Voss realized that the silence wasn't a choice anymore. It was a weapon, and he was the one holding the trigger. He looked at Syra, who was sitting on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands. He didn't offer her platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He just sat next to her and opened the wall. He led her into the silence. He showed her the quiet garden he had built in the center of the storm, a place where the noise couldn't reach them. Breathe, princess, he thought. The universe can wait for 5 minutes. We're still here. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and through the synaptic lattice, two broken souls found a single, steady rhythm. They weren't components. They weren't keys. They were two heartbeats in the dark, and for now that was enough. Outside, the violet light of the void continued to pulse, 1,000 light years of hunger watching a single quiet room. The war for the ether spire had begun, but in the silence, Kalen and Syra were finally finding their voice. The ether spire did not breathe. It recirculated. In the wake of the hangar massacre, the air felt recycled too many times, tasting of scorched ozone and the metallic tang of fear that no filtration system could fully scrub away. Princess Syra sat on the floor of her quarters, the silver braids of her hair coming undone, falling like frayed wires over her shoulders. Through the synaptic lattice, the connection to Kalen was a dull, throbbing ache at the base of her skull. It felt like a low-voltage wire submerged in salt water. "You are thinking about it again," Kalen's voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't a spoken word, but a ripple in the pond of her consciousness. "I killed him, Kalen," Syra thought back, her mental voice sharp with a jagged edge of trauma. "I didn't just stop him. I used your mind as a whetstone, and I turned the noise into a blade. I felt his synapses snap like dry twigs." Kalen was 3 floors away, confined to the human tier barracks under the Archon's new security mandates. Yet his presence was as real to her as the cold floor beneath her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it was for the greater good. That wasn't his way. "You saved 40 cadets," Kalen replied, "and you saved me. If that's the weight you have to carry, then carry it. But do not pretend that doing nothing would have been cleaner. In the void, there is no such thing as a clean pair of hands." Syra stood up, walking to the panoramic window. The void bleed was larger now. It had expanded by nearly 3% in the last 6 hours, its violet edges fraying into the blackness of space. It looked like an eye that was slowly, painfully opening. "Mentor Zector says the Archon is calling for an emergency session of the High Council," Syra said aloud, her voice sounding hollow in the empty room. "They are claiming the breach in Sector 12 was an inside job. They are looking for a scapegoat, Kalen." "I know," Kalen's thought was weary. "I'm the only human in the tactical track with a survival rating lower than a toaster. I'm a ghost that suddenly started haunting the high-rent districts. I'm the perfect candidate for a public execution." Syra felt a spike of protective rage. It tasted like copper and lightning. "They won't touch you. I am the crown mind of the Lunari. My word is law on this station." "Your word is a suggestion to a man like Malcor," Kalen countered. "He doesn't care about Lunari law. He cares about the suture loom. He saw what we did in the hangar, Syra. He saw that you can weaponize my silence. He doesn't want to kill us. He wants to break us so he can rebuild us as his own personal artillery." A sharp chime interrupted their mental link. Syra's door hissed open, and Raul Knox stepped inside. Knox was a changeling, currently wearing the form of a high-ranking security officer, his skin the color of polished marble, and his eyes 2 empty, black pits. He was Malcor's right hand, the man who handled the dirty work that required a lighter touch than a Thraxian hammer. "Princess," Knox said, bowing with a fluidity that was unnerving. "The Archon requests your presence in the Strategic Command Center. It concerns the integrity of the synaptic lattice records." Syra stiffened. "The records are encrypted with royal ciphers, Knox. Not even Malcor has the authority to view them without my consent." "The Archon has found irregularities," Knox replied, his voice a smooth, oily tenor. "It seems someone has been tampering with the synchronization logs. There are gaps in the data, particularly during the hangar breach. It suggests that your partner, Cadet Voss, may have been suppressing his telemetry to hide unauthorized communications with the boarding party. That is a lie, Sierra hissed. Knox merely tilted his head. I am only the messenger, Princess. But the data does not lie. The Archon is currently reviewing the footage from the maintenance vents. It shows a human figure, matching Voss's biometrics, bypassing the security locks 10 minutes before the attack. Sierra felt Kalen's reaction through the lattice. It wasn't denial or shock. It was a cold, sinking realization. He didn't fight the accusation. He absorbed it like he absorbed the noise of the rift. Sierra, don't go. Kalen's voice was a frantic whisper in her head. It's a setup. He's pulling us apart. I have to go, Sarah thought back. If I stay here, I look guilty. If I go, I can fight this. Just watch your six, Kalen sent. The air is getting thin. Syra followed Knox through the winding corridors of the ether spire. The station was on high alert, with blue emergency lights strobing against the white walls. She saw squads of Thraxian enforcers patrolling the junctions, their pulse rifles held at the ready. The atmosphere was no longer that of an academy. It was a prison. When they reached the strategic command center, the air was cold enough to frost her breath. Archon Malcor was standing at the central holotank, his red cybernetic eyes fixed on a scrolling stream of binary code. Mentor Zektor was there too, looking uncharacteristically small and old, his optical sensors flickering with a nervous uncertainty. Princess, Malcor said, not turning around. We have a problem. I hear you have a penchant for fiction, Archon, Sarah retorted, stepping into the light of the holotank. My partner was with me every second of the trial. He didn't bypass any locks. Malcor gestured to the screen. A grainy black and white video began to play. It showed the maintenance corridor leading to the Sector 12 life support systems. A figure in gray fatigues was hunched over the terminal, his fingers moving with the mechanical precision Kalen had displayed in the arena. The face was obscured by a shadow, but the ID tag on the sleeve was clear. Voss K. This footage was recovered from a backup server that the mercenaries tried to scrap, Malcor said. It seems your human friend was making sure the fire suppression foam wouldn't just blind the drones, but also disable the security cameras in the mercenaries' path. He wasn't saving the cadets, Syra. He was clearing the lane for his employers. This is a deep fake, Syra said, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kalen is a suture. He spent his life being invisible. He doesn't have employers. He barely has a lunch card. A suture, Malcor repeated, turning to face her with a cold metallic smile. Yes, that is the fairy tale he told you, isn't it? A rare mutation, a tragic backstory. It's a very compelling narrative for a lonely princess looking for a soulmate in the dark. But the reality is much more mundane. Kalen Voss is a failed engineering student with a history of debt and a record of minor digital sabotage on 3 different mining colonies. He didn't pick you, Syra. He was planted. Syra felt the link to Kalen's shudder. Through the lattice, she felt a wave of nausea and a sudden sharp pain. He was being detained. She could feel the cold metal of binders snapping around his wrists, the rough shove of an enforcer against his shoulder. Syra! Kalen screamed in her mind. They're taking me to the lower decks. They're taking me to the Silence Wing. The Silence Wing was a high-security detention center located directly above the station's reactor core. It was lined with lead and psionic dampeners. It was a place designed to kill a lattice bond. Stop this! Syra yelled, reaching for Malcor's throat. Knox was faster. He stepped between them, his hand moving in a blurred arc. He didn't strike her. He pressed a small silver disc against the base of her neck, right over the lattice port. Syra's world exploded into white noise. The connection to Kalen didn't just break, it was ripped out by the roots. She felt a phantom sensation of her own heart stopping, a crushing void where his heartbeat used to be. She fell to her knees, gasping for air that felt like broken glass. The princess is suffering from a neural overload, Malcor said, his voice sounding distant and muffled. Take her to the infirmary and ensure the human is prepared for interrogation. We need to know who he's working for before the next wave of the void bleed hits. As Syra was dragged away by Knox's marble-skinned guards, Her last conscious thought wasn't for her own safety. It was for the boy in the back row. She realized that she had been so afraid of her own power, so focused on her own grief, that she had missed the most important lesson of the silence. Courage wasn't about being strong enough to kill. It was about being brave enough to trust someone when the whole universe was screaming at you to run, and she had let them take him. The silence wing was exactly what it promised. In the lower sub-levels of the ether spire, the walls were 10 meters thick, composed of a dense alloy that absorbed every vibration, every stray radio wave, and every flicker of psychic energy. To Kalen Voss, it was a tomb. Without the synaptic lattice, without Syra's golden frequency to anchor him, the world was a flat, gray desert. He was strapped into an interrogation chair, his arms and legs held by magnetic clamps. Above him, a single harsh white light hummed with a frequency that felt like a needle scratching against the inside of a skull. He was alone, but he could still hear the void bleed. Without the dampening effect of the station's upper-level shields, the rift was a roar in his ears, a chaotic symphony of a billion dying stars. "You should stop fighting it," a voice said from the shadows. Archon Malkor stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing his formal robes anymore. He was in a sleek, black combat suit, his cybernetic eyes glowing with a predatory red light. He held a data pad that pulsed with the blue light of the stolen lattice records. "You're a fascinating specimen, Voss," Malkor said, circling the chair. "A human who can hear the heartbeat of the void. Do you have any idea how much the Synaptic Union would pay for your brain? They've spent 50 years trying to build a sensor that can do what your nervous system does naturally." "I'm not for sale, Archon," Kalen rasped. His throat felt like it was full of dry sand. "Everything is for sale," Malkor countered. "It's just a matter of currency. For you, the currency is silence." "I can give you a room that is truly quiet, Kalen. A place where the rift can't find you. All you have to do is tell me the sequence." "What sequence?" "The suture sequence. The frequency the princess used to turn you into a weapon in the hangar. She didn't just shoot that mercenary. She channeled the void through you. You were the lens. I want the focal length. I want to know how to trigger that output without the emotional baggage of a teenage girl." Kalen looked up, a bloody grin stretching his lips. "You can't, you gearhead. The suture isn't a machine. It's a reaction. It only works because she's there. It only works because I trust her." Malkor leaned in, his metallic face inches from Kalen's. "Trust? You think a Lunari princess trusts a human? She chose you because you were a curiosity, a stray dog she could dress up in a uniform. She's already forgotten your name, Voss. She's in the infirmary right now, being prepared for a new partner. Varkas Krell is a much more suitable match for a future queen." Kalen felt a pang of doubt, a small, cold worm burrowing into his heart. He remembered the way Syra had looked at him in the hangar, the horror in her eyes after she had killed the man. Maybe Malkor was right. Maybe he was just a component that had outlived its usefulness. But then, he remembered the silence. Not the dead silence of this cell, but the quiet garden he had shared with her in the lattice. He remembered the taste of her lavender energy, the way her heart had slowed down to match his. That wasn't an experiment. That was a choice. "I don't believe you," Kalen said. Malkor sighed, a sound of simulated disappointment. "I was hoping you'd be more pragmatic. But no matter. If you won't give me the sequence willingly, we'll just have to extract it. The process is messy. It tends to leave the subject with the mental capacity of a sea sponge, but the data will be intact." Malkor reached for a control panel on the wall. He began to input a series of commands that made the interrogation chair hum with a lethal amount of electrical energy. "Wait," Kalen said, his voice trembling. Malkor paused, his red eyes flickering. "Change of heart?" "If you're going to scrap me," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "at least do it right. The sequence isn't in my head. It's in the lattice port. It's a biorhythmic lock. You need to activate the secondary tap or the data will self-destruct." Malkor frowned. "The biorhythmic lock? My technicians didn't mention a secondary tap. That's because they're looking at it with Thraxian eyes, Kalen said, his mind racing. It's a human design. Underneath the silver housing, there's a manual override. Malcor stepped closer, his curiosity overriding his caution. He reached out with a metallic finger, touching the raw, bruised skin at the base of Kalen's neck. He began to peel back the edge of the silver port. Kalen took a breath. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a prince. He was a boy who had learned to survive by listening to the things no one else wanted to hear. He reached out with his mind, not toward the lattice, but toward the station itself. He felt the massive reactor core humming beneath his feet. He felt the millions of liters of coolant rushing through the pipes. And he felt the tiny rhythmic tick of the Archon's own cybernetic heart. Now, Kalen thought. He didn't fight the noise. He invited it in. He dropped every wall in his mind, every barrier he had spent 15 years building. He opened the door to the void bleed and let the screaming universe flood his nervous system. The effect was instantaneous. Kalen's body buckled as the energy surged through him. He became a conduit for the psychic fallout of the rift. The white light in the room exploded. The magnetic clamps on his arms shattered as the metal was twisted by a sudden, violent gravitational shift. Malcor screamed, a sound of grinding gears and distorted audio. The energy hitting Kalen was being projected outward, a shock wave of raw, unfiltered chaos. The Archon's cybernetic systems began to seize. Sparks flew from his eyes and his marble-skinned guards were thrown against the walls by a psychic gale. Kalen fell from the chair, his skin glowing with a faint violet light. He was shaking, his vision blurring, his mind on the verge of total collapse. He had opened the suture, and now he couldn't close it. He was drowning in the noise. Kalen! The voice wasn't a memory. It was a golden spike of light that pierced through the gray static. Syra. She was there, at the door of the cell. She was covered in soot, her silver hair singed, her kinetic gauntlets glowing with a fierce emerald light. Behind her, Varkas Krell was swinging a heavy metal beam, knocking aside the remaining enforcers with a savage glee. Kalen! Syra screamed, running toward him. She grabbed his hands, and the moment their skin touched, the synaptic lattice roared back to life. But it wasn't the same as before. The connection was deeper, wider, a bridge of fire that spanned the distance between their souls. Syra didn't try to dampen the noise. She didn't try to hide in the silence. She grabbed the chaos that was killing Kalen, and she gave it a shape. She turned the roar into a rhythm. She turned the scream into a song. Together they projected a wall of energy that blew the door of the silence wing off its hinges. The Archon was slumped in the corner, his systems rebooting, his metallic body smoking. "We have to go," Varkas yelled, his forearms gesturing toward the corridor. "The whole sublevel is destabilizing. The human just turned the reactor into a psych bomb." Syra pulled Kalen to his feet. His eyes were still glowing violet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He looked at her, and for a second he didn't recognize her. He saw only the light. "It's me, Kalen," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in his mind. "I'm here. I didn't forget your name." Kalen blinked, the violet light receding. "Syra?" "Yeah," she said, a small, tearful smile breaking through her soot-stained face. "And if you ever apologize to a training dummy again, I'm going to kill you myself. Now move." They ran through the crumbling sublevels of the spire. The station was shaking, the structural supports groaning under the weight of the psychic storm Kalen had unleashed. They reached a maintenance lift, and Varkas jammed the controls, sending them hurtling toward the upper decks. "Why did you come back?" Kalen asked, leaning against the wall of the lift, his breath coming in ragged gas. Malcor said, "He said you were replacing me." Varkas let out a snort. "The lizard man wanted me to bond with a royal. I told him I'd rather bond with a vacuum cleaner. At least a vacuum cleaner knows its place. Besides, the princess was very persuasive. She broke out of the infirmary using a lunch tray and a piece of wire. I figured any team that can do that is a team I want to be on." Syra looked at Kalen, her emerald eyes soft. "Malcor was right about one thing, Kalen. I did choose you because you were a curiosity. I chose you because I was afraid of being alone with my own power. I thought you were a shield I could hide behind." She took his hand, her fingers weaving through his. "But in that cell, when I felt you open the suture, I realize that you're not my shield. You're my partner. And if the universe wants to scream at us, then we'll just have to scream back louder. Kalen felt a surge of warmth through the lattice. The cold, gray desert was gone. In its place was a landscape of silver snow and golden sun. He realized then that his silence hadn't been a way to hide from the world. It had been a way to wait for it. He had spent 20 years trying to be invisible, thinking that his mutation was a curse that made him a component, a tool for others to use. But Syra had shown him that his weakness was actually his greatest strength. He was a suture because he could endure the pain of the world without letting it break him. He was the anchor that allowed the light to shine. The lift doors hissed open on the observation deck. Mentor Zektor was waiting for them, his 7 optical sensors rotating frantically. "You're alive," the mentor said, his voice sounding relieved. "But the station is lost. Malcor has retreated to his flagship, and he's initiated the final sequence. He's not trying to close the void bleed anymore. He's trying to widen it. He wants to bring the entire Shadow Fleet through the rift in 1 hour." "Then we stop him," Syra said, her voice like steel. "How?" Zektor asked. "The station's weapons are offline. The stabilizers are failing. We have no army." "We have the suture loom," Kalen said, standing tall. "And we have the sequence." Zektor looked at the boy, then at the princess. The connection between them was visible now, a faint, shimmering arc of light that pulsed with the rhythm of 2 hearts beating as one. It was a sight that hadn't been seen on the Ether Spire in a millennium. "The loom requires a sacrifice, Kalen," Zektor warned. "It's not just a machine, it's a bridge. To close the rift, one of you has to stay behind in the silence. One of you has to become the anchor." "I know," Kalen said. "I'm not leaving him," Syra added, her grip on his hand tightening. Zektor bowed his head, a gesture of profound respect. "Then Godspeed, cadets. The future of the convergence is in your hands." As they turned toward the sub-levels where the loom waited, the void bleed outside roared one last time. It was a sound of hunger, of anticipation. But Kalen Voss didn't flinch. He didn't close his eyes. He looked straight into the violet heart of the storm and he smiled. He wasn't a component anymore. He was the man who was going to stitch the universe back together. And for the first time in his life, the silence felt like home. The humanistic theme had been tested in the fires of betrayal and isolation, and it had emerged not as a fragile hope, but as a forged reality. They had learned that the cost of not trusting was a world of gray static, but the price of courage was the chance to define their own destiny. The descent into the sub-levels of the Ether Spire was not a journey through architecture, but a journey through a dying beast. The lift had long since lost its smooth, humming grace, replaced by a series of violent, mechanical shutters that threatened to shear the car from its magnetic rails. Every few floors, the emergency amber strobes would flicker and die, plunged into a suffocating darkness before the backup capacitors kicked in with a desperate whining hiss. Through the synaptic lattice, Kalen Voss felt every groan of the station as if it were a fracture in his own ribs. "We are running out of floors," Kalen thought, his mental voice a steady, low frequency that pulsed against Syra's mind like a heartbeat. Syra stood against the back wall of the lift, her kinetic gauntlets humming with a restless, green energy. Her silver hair was damp with sweat, and her eyes were fixed on the floor indicator, which was currently jammed between sub-level 24 and 25. "I can feel the Archon's hamjoy, Kalen. They are positioning themselves in a spearhead formation. They are not just waiting for the rift to open, they are helping it. They are using their gravity wells to pull at the edges of the void bleed." Kalen leaned his head against the cold metal of the lift. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he let the wall in his mind go translucent. The noise was no longer a roar, it was a physical weight. He could feel the pressure of the void pushing against the Ether Spire's hull, a trillion tons of non-existence screaming to be let in. It was a sound that had driven thousands of people to madness, but to Kalen, it was simply the background noise of his life. They want the noise, Kalen realized. Malcor thinks he can harness the chaos. He thinks if he opens the door wide enough, he can ride the wave into the heart of the convergence. "He is a fool," Syra spat, her thoughts sharp and metallic. "You cannot ride a hurricane, Kalen. You can only be shredded by it." The lift came to a bone-jarring halt. The doors groaned, opening only halfway before jamming on a pile of fallen ceiling tiles. Beyond the doors lay sub-level 30, the restricted engineering deck that housed the suture loom. The air here was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and the dry, biting scent of ancient dust. Varkas Krell was the first one through the gap, his forearms maneuvering a heavy pulse repeater he had scavenged from a fallen sentry droid. "Clear," the Thraxian barked, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "But we've got company on the high side. Rel and his spooks are dropping in from the ventilation shafts. We need to move, and we need to move now." Kalen stepped out of the lift, his legs feeling heavy. The suture awakening in the silence wing had left him drained, his nervous system buzzing with a residual electrical charge that made his fingertips tingle. He felt like a glass vase that had been shattered and glued back together. He was functional, but he was fragile. Syra was at his side in an instant, her hand gripping his elbow. "You are flatlining, boss. Take a breath." "I'm solid, Syra," Kalen lied, though his heart rate was spiking to 110 beats per minute. "Just keep the spooks off my back while I find the interface." The corridor was a labyrinth of copper piping and massive coolant vats. This was the true heart of the Ether Spire, a place that hadn't seen a maintenance crew in 300 years. The technology here was alien, organic, and terrifyingly complex. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, bioluminescent blue light, and the floor was etched with silver circuitry that vibrated beneath their boots. As they reached the entrance to the loom chamber, a series of red laser sights bloomed across the walls. "Contact!" Varkas roared. He opened fire, the heavy thud-thud-thud of the pulse repeater filling the hallway with strobing blue light. 3 figures in shimmering, chameleon glass armor dropped from the ceiling. They were void breakers, Malkor's elite assassins, trained to fight in the high-gravity environments of the rift. They moved with a disturbing insect-like grace, their blades humming with a molecular shear frequency that could cut through starship hull plating. Syra didn't hesitate. She stepped in front of Kalen, her hands moving in a blurred defensive arc. A shimmering wall of green kinetic energy materialized in front of them, catching a volley of pulse bolts. "Go!" Syra yelled over the noise of the firefight. "Kalen, get to the loom! Varkas and I will hold the door." Kalen looked at her, and for a second, the synaptic lattice flared with a blinding intensity. He saw her fear, her exhaustion, and her absolute unshakable resolve. She was a princess of the Lunari, a girl who had been raised to be a symbol of perfection. But here in the dirt and the dark, she was something much more. She was a shield. "Do not die, Syra," Kalen thought, a rare note of raw emotion bleeding through his mental walls. "Not on the schedule, Voss," she thought back, a ghost of a smile touching her mind. "Now move your ass." Kalen turned and ran into the loom chamber. The room was vast, a circular amphitheater of chrome and bone that seemed to descend forever into the darkness of the station's core. In the center stood the suture loom, a towering spire of crystalline fibers and golden gears that reached toward the ceiling. It looked less like a machine and more like a frozen explosion, a moment of divine creation captured in metal and light. At the base of the machine, a series of translucent cables hung like the weeping branches of a willow tree. This was the interface. Kalen approached the central console, his hands shaking as he touched the ancient glass surface. The machine didn't wake up with a hum. It woke up with a whisper. 1,000 voices seemed to murmur in his head, a chorus of the architects who had built this place a millennium ago. Identification required, the machine's voice was not synthetic, but a resonance that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his brain. "Kalen Voss," he whispered. "Suture, Grade 1. The golden gears began to turn, a slow, majestic movement that sent a vibration through the entire sublevel. The crystalline fibers began to glow with a soft, violet light, matching the frequency of the void bleed outside. Kalen felt the machine reaching out for him, searching for the fit. He looked at the 2 connection ports. One was a standard neural jack, designed for a Lunari crown mind. The other was a jagged, biological socket that looked like it would require him to give up his very skin. This is the sacrifice, Kalen realized. The loom doesn't just need a pilot. It needs an anchor. Outside the chamber, the sound of the battle was intensifying. He could hear Varkus's guttural roars and the high-pitched shriek of Syra's kinetic blasts. They were being pushed back. Rel and the Void Breakers were relentless, their chameleon glass armor making them nearly impossible to track in the flickering light. Kalen looked at the jagged socket. He remembered what Malcor had said about his childhood on the mining colony. He remembered the silence of the dying, the way the world had felt so cold and empty once the noise had stopped. He had spent 15 years thinking that he was a victim of that silence, that it was a hole in his soul that could never be filled. But standing here, at the heart of the universe, he realized he had it backward. The silence wasn't a hole, it was a vessel. He was a suture because he was the only one who could hold the noise without letting it break him. He wasn't a component to be used. He was the only thing strong enough to be the bridge. He wasn't a failure, he was the solution. Courage isn't about not being afraid, Kalen whispered to the empty room. It's about being the only one who stays in the room when everyone else has run away. He reached for the biological cable, his fingers closing around the cold, pulsating wire. Through the lattice, he felt Syra's distress. She had been hit. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his left shoulder, followed by a wave of cold nausea. "Syra!" he screamed in his mind. I'm fine." Her thought was weak, flickering like a dying candle. Just a scratch. "Varkus is down, Kalen. I'm the only one left. You have to close it now." Kalen looked at the cable in his hand. If he connected, he would be anchored to the loom forever. He would become a part of the station, a living dampener for the void bleed. He would never walk in the silver snow of Lunaris. He would never see a sunrise that wasn't filtered through a view screen. He would be alone in the silence, but as he looked at the connection, he felt a sudden golden warmth through the lattice. It wasn't a thought, but a presence. Syra was there, her mind reaching out to his, not to command him, but to hold him. "You are never alone, Kalen." Her voice was a steady, beautiful song in the dark. "I am here, in the silence, in the noise, in the void. I am here." Kalen smiled. He took a breath, a deep, steady breath that tasted of copper and hope. He jammed the cable into the port at the base of his skull. The universe exploded. He was no longer a boy in a room. He was a frequency. He was a wave of pure white light that shot through the ether spire, through the hull plating, and straight into the violet heart of the void bleed. He saw the Archon's ham joy, 1,000 ships huddled like frightened insects on the edge of the abyss. He saw the rift, a jagged tear that was currently being held open by 1,000,000,000 tons of hatred. And then he saw the thread. The suture loom was not a weapon. It was a needle. With a mental roar that shook the very stars, Kalen Voss grabbed the edges of the universe and began to sew. The pain was a spectrum of colors Kalen hadn't known existed. It wasn't just his body that was being pulled apart. It was his history, his memories, the very atoms of his identity. He felt himself being stretched across 30,000 light years of empty space, his nervous system acting as the thread that was currently being pulled through the eye of a needle. "Focus, Kalen!" Sierra's voice was the only thing keeping him from dissolving into pure energy. She had entered the chamber now, her left arm hanging uselessly at her side, blood staining her white uniform. She crawled to the secondary console, her fingers trembling as she plugged her own neural jack into the pilot's seat. "I am here," she thought, her frequency slamming into his like a tidal wave of golden light. "Take my will. Take my strength. Use it as the anchor." Kalen didn't argue. He opened the floodgates. The connection between them was no longer a lattice. It was a fusion. For a moment, they were not two people, but a single entity, the crown and the suture, the singer and the song. Syra provided the direction, the royal intent of a lineage that had guarded the stars for 10,000 years. Kalen provided the endurance, the human stubbornness that refused to break under the weight of the void. Together they began to stitch. Outside the station, the void bleed reacted with a violent spatial convulsion. The violet clouds began to swirl in a perfect geometric spiral, turning inward as the suture loom pulled the edges of reality back together. The ham joy of Archon Malcor was caught in the gravitational backwash. Ships were being tossed aside like leaves in a gale. their engines screaming as they fought to escape the closing trap. On the bridge of the Shadow Apex, Archon Malcor watched the telemetry with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "This is impossible," he screamed, his metallic voice cracking with distortion. "No human can survive that load. The boy should be a smear of carbon on the floor." "He is not just a human, Archon." Rel's voice came over the comms, though it was garbled by static. "He is the suture, and he has a partner." Malcor turned his red eyes toward the ether spire. "Fire everything," he ordered. "Target the sublevels. If I cannot have the rift, I will turn that station into dust." A barrage of heavy-caliber railgun slugs slammed into the ether spire. The station groaned, its structural integrity failing as the lower decks were pounded into scrap metal. In the loom chamber, the ceiling began to collapse. Massive girders fell, crushing the cooling vats and sending clouds of freezing steam into the air. Varkas Krell, who had somehow managed to drag himself back to his feet, stood at the entrance of the chamber. He was a ruin of a warrior, his obsidian skin cracked and bleeding, but he held his ground. He didn't have his pulse repeater anymore. He was holding two massive pieces of fallen debris, his forearms straining to keep the doorway from collapsing on Kalen and Syra. "Keep going, kids," Varkas bellowed, his voice a ragged, bloody roar. "I've got the roof. Just finish the job." Kalen felt Varkas's pain through the link, a heavy, dull ache of overstressed muscle and shattered bone. He felt Syra's exhaustion, the way her psychic reserves were being drained to the very dregs, and he felt his own life force flickering, the suture loom demanding more than he had left to give. He remembered the lesson of the silence. He had always thought that to be brave, he had to be loud. He thought he had to be a warrior like Varkas, or a leader like Syra. But he realized now that the most important kind of courage was the kind that didn't need an audience. It was the courage to be the foundation, to be the part of the machine that no one ever sees, but without which everything falls apart. "I am the anchor," Kalen thought, a sense of profound peace washing over him. "I am the silence that holds the world." He let go of his fear. He let go of his desire to survive. He became the loom. The violet light of the void bleed didn't just fade, it inverted. A beam of pure, brilliant white light shot out from the ether spire, a needle of reality that pierced the heart of the rift. The spiral tightened, faster and faster, until the violet clouds were swallowed by the white. Then there was a sound like a single, perfect note on a cello. The rift snapped shut. The spatial geometry of the sector reset itself in an instant. The gravitational backwash was so violent that every ship in Malcor's Hamjoy was either disabled or thrown 10 light-years into the deep black. The Shadow Apex spun out of control, its engines venting plasma as it was cast into the dark. In the loom chamber, the light vanished. The golden gears of the machine ground to a halt, their surfaces dull and cracked. The crystalline fibers shattered, falling like snow onto the floor. Kalen fell from the interface, the cable disconnecting from his neck with a wet, sickening pop. He hit the floor hard, his body feeling like lead. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't feel his arms. He could only feel the silence. But it was a different silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating wool of his childhood. It was the silence of a job well done. It was the quiet of a house after a storm has passed. Syra crawled toward him, her movements slow and agonizing. She reached his side and pulled his head into her lap. "Kalen?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Kalen, speak to me." Kalen opened his eyes. The violet glow was gone. His eyes were gray again, weary and human. Is it closed?" "It's gone, Kalen," Syra sobbed, tears carving tracks through the soot on her face. "You did it. You stitched it." Kalen managed a weak, trembling smile. "Solid." Varkas Krell let out a heavy groan as he dropped the debris he had been holding. The doorway collapsed behind him, sealing them into the chamber. But for the first time in his life, the Thraxian warrior didn't look like he wanted to fight. He sat down on the floor, his forearms resting on his knees. "You two, you're both insane," Varkas wheezed. "I'm definitely putting in for a transfer to the logistics track. This hero business is too much for my health." Kalen looked up at Syra. The synaptic lattice was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't a connection of pain or necessity. It was a shared history. He could feel her pride in him, a warm, golden sun that chased away the last of the gray static. I found my purpose, Syra, Kalen thought, his mental voice a whisper. I found it in the quiet. I know, she thought back, and I found mine. I was born to be a queen, Kalen, but I choose to be a partner. As they sat there in the ruins of the loom chamber, the ether spire began to stabilize. The emergency lights in the room flickered to life, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The station was a wreck, but it was a wreck that was still breathing. Kalen realized then that the sacrifice hadn't been his life. It had been his isolation. By opening himself up to the void, he had also opened himself up to the world. He was no longer the boy in the back row, hiding from the noise. He was the man who had faced the loudest sound in the universe and found a way to make it quiet. Transformation is always painful, Kalen thought as he watched the silver hair of the princess fall over his face. But the view from the other side is worth the price. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 20 years, he didn't have to build a wall. He just listened to the silence, and he found that it was beautiful. Through the broken ceiling, a single star was visible, not a violet spark of the void, but a steady white light. It was a reminder that even in the darkest sublevels of a dying station, hope was not an abstract concept. It was a choice. It was a heartbeat. It was two people holding hands in the dark, waiting for the morning to come. The humanistic theme had moved from the subtext of their survival to the very heart of their victory. They had learned that the greatest act of courage was not to conquer the void, but to allow oneself to be known by another. In the silence between them, the future was finally beginning to speak. The ether spire did not return to life with a triumphant roar. It came back with a series of rhythmic, metallic coughs. The emergency lighting in the loom chamber flickered from a dying amber to a steady, clinical white. Dust motes, disturbed by the psychic shockwave that had closed the void bleed, settled slowly like gray snow over the wreckage of the ancient machines. Kalen Voss lay on the cracked obsidian floor, his head resting in Princess Syra's lap. The silence in his mind was no longer a wall of static. It was a vast open field, quiet and cool. I can still feel you, Kalen thought, his mental voice a soft vibration that hummed against Syra's consciousness. It was no longer a struggle to speak. The lattice had smoothed out, the jagged edges of their bond worn down into a polished, crystalline bridge. I am not going anywhere, Voss, Syra replied. Her hand was steady on his forehead, though her uniform was a ruin of soot and dried blood. You are stuck with me until the paperwork is filed, and knowing the Alliance, that will take at least 10 years. Above them, the ceiling groaned. Varkas Krell was sitting a few meters away, his forearms propped up on his knees, his massive chest heaving. He had taken the brunt of the structural collapse to keep the doorway open, and his obsidian skin was mapped with thousands of tiny white fractures where the pressure had nearly reached his breaking point. Is it dead? Varkas asked, his voice a ragged, bloody rasp. The rift. Is the damn thing finally smoke-checked? It is closed, Varkas, Kalen said, his voice raspy but clear. I stitched it. There is nothing left but the scar. Varkas let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Good. If I never have to look at that purple eyeball again, it will be too soon. My sensors are completely zeroed. I think I've got enough ozone in my lungs to power a shuttle for a week. The heavy blast doors at the far end of the chamber, which had been welded shut by the Archon's mercenaries, suddenly hissed. The metal glowed red-hot before being kicked inward with a violent clang. A squad of Alliance peacekeepers in gleaming white and gold vacuum armor flooded into the room, their pulse rifles scanning the shadows. Behind them walked Mentor Zektor, his 7 optical sensors whirring frantically as he took in the devastation. Medical! Zektor bellowed, his voice vibrating through the chamber. Get a trauma team down here now. I have 3 cadets in critical condition. One of the peacekeepers, a tall human officer, with a scar running across his nose, approached the group. He looked at the shattered suture loom, then at the boy on the floor, whose eyes were still faintly tinged with the violet light of the void. Archon Malkor's flagship has been intercepted 12 light-years out, the officer reported, his voice crisp and professional. He's in a high-security holding cell on the Vanguard. The Shadow Fleet is in full retreat. You did it, kids, You actually did it. Sarah didn't look at the officer. She looked at Zektor. My brother's death was a calibration, Mentor. Malcor admitted it. He used Calum Minor as a field test for the rift. Zektor bowed his head, his sensors dimming to a mournful blue. We suspected, Princess, but without proof, the High Council could not act against the Archon. The political cost would have been too high. The political cost? Sarah's voice was like a whip crack. My brother is a ghost. Kalen's parents are dust. 3,000 people on Hestia Prime suffocated because Malcor wanted to see if despair could power a jump drive. Do not talk to me about the cost of politics. The medics arrived then, unfolding high-tech grav stretchers. They tried to pull Kalen away from Syra, but he gripped her hand with a strength that surprised them both. Wait, Kalen wheezed. I need to see it. The medics hesitated, looking at Zektor, who gave a sharp nod. They helped Kalen to his feet, supporting his weight as he shuffled toward the viewing port in the upper gallery of the chamber. Sarah walked beside him, her arm wrapped around his waist, their hearts beating in a synchronized rhythm that the lattice projected like a drumbeat. Outside, the void bleed was gone. In its place was a long, shimmering silver streak that stretched across the stars, a scar in the fabric of space-time. It didn't pulse, it didn't roar. It simply existed, a quiet reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. It's beautiful, Syra whispered. It's quiet, Kalen corrected. For the first time in 20 years, the universe isn't screaming at me. I can hear the stars, Syra. They don't sound like pain. They sound like light. As the medics finally loaded them onto the stretchers for the long trip to the infirmary, Kalen felt a shift in the atmosphere of the station. The ether spire was no longer a hunting ground. The fear that had permeated every hallway, the rigid hierarchy of predator and prey, was beginning to dissolve. He saw a group of Thraxian cadets helping a wounded avian researcher. He saw a changeling sharing an oxygen tank with a human technician. They didn't just save the world, Zektor said to the Alliance officer as the stretchers passed by. They broke the script. In the infirmary, the recovery was long and grueling. The synaptic lattice had been pushed beyond its design limits, leaving both Kalen and Sarah with neural fatigue that felt like a permanent hangover. For the first 3 days, they weren't allowed to speak aloud, as any sensory input was too much for their raw nerves. But they didn't need to speak. Through the link, they shared memories of the silence and dreams of the future. Varkas visited them on the 4th day. He was encased in a medical exosuit to support his fractured bones, but his spirit was as sharp as ever. The scuttlebutt in the mess hall is that you're both getting the Medal of Valor, Varkas said, sitting down heavily on a reinforced stool. And the princess's father is sending a royal cruiser to pick you up. He wants a full debrief. Kalen looked at Syra. Are you going back to Lunaris? Syra stared at her hands, the silver fur on her ears twitching. My father wants me to lead the reconstruction of the border territories. He says the convergence needs a crown mind to restore the faith. But I told him I'm not going without my anchor. Varkas let out a low whistle. A human suture in the Lunari court? That's going to ruffle some serious feathers, Princess. The traditionalists will have a collective heart attack. Let them, Syra said, her emerald eyes flashing with a familiar fire. I'm done being a symbol of perfection. I'd rather be a person who makes a difference. And Kalen, he's the only one who knows how to listen when the world gets too loud. Kalen felt a surge of warmth through the lattice. He looked at Varkas. And what about you, big guy? Kicking rocks or staying in the fight? Varkas grinned, showing a row of razor-sharp teeth. Mentor Zektor offered me a position as a combat instructor for the next class. He says the Spire needs someone to teach the grunts that muscles are useless if you don't have a brain. I told him I'd take the job if I get to keep my repeater. As the days turned into weeks, the ether spire began to heal. The scars on the hull were patched. The suture loom was preserved as a monument rather than a machine. Kalen spent his afternoons on the observation deck, not hiding in the shadows, but sitting in the center of the light. He found that he didn't need the wall anymore. The noise of the station was still there. The clatter of boots, the hum of the air scrubbers, the chatter of a dozen species. And it no longer felt like an attack. It felt like life. He realized then that the silence had never been his enemy. It was his training ground. It had taught him how to find the center of the storm, how to stay steady when everything else was falling apart. And Syra had taught him that the center was meant to be shared. They had saved the universe, yes, but more importantly, they had saved each other from the isolation of their own excellence. They were no longer components in a machine. They were the authors of a new story. And as the silver scar in space began to fade into the background of 1,000 stars, Kalen Voss realized that he was finally truly awake. 3 months had passed since the closure of the Void Bleed, and the Ether Spire had undergone a transformation that was more than just structural. The white, sterile walls had been repainted with murals depicting the cultures of every species in the Alliance. The rigid militaristic schedules had been softened to allow for communal gatherings in the Great Atrium. The station was no longer a fortress, it was a harbor. Kalen Voss stood in the center of the new Sensory Integration Lab, a facility he had helped design. It was a large circular room filled with soft, glowing orbs and acoustic panels that created a perfect balance of sound and silence. He was no longer wearing the oversized gray fatigues of a failing cadet. He wore the dark blue uniform of a specialist, with the silver emblem of the suture on his collar. He wasn't alone. A group of 5 young cadets, 3 humans, a changeling, and a small 4-armed Thraxian, sat around him. They were all sutures, or variations of the mutation, discovered across the sector once the Alliance started looking for them. "The trick isn't to block it out," Kalen said, his voice calm and resonant. His gray eyes were clear, no longer shadowed by exhaustion. "If you fight the noise, it becomes a hammer. If you listen to it, it becomes a guide. You have to find the frequency of the room, then you have to find your own." The young Thraxian, a boy named Grant, looked up with wide eyes. "But it hurts, a specialist Voss. The engine hum. It feels like it's scraping my brain." "I know, Grant," Kalen said, walking over to the boy. He placed a hand on Grant's shoulder, a gentle, grounding touch. He didn't use the lattice. He didn't need to. He just offered a presence that was steady and sure. "Close your eyes. Don't listen to the engine. Listen to the person next to you. Listen to their heartbeat. That's the only sound that matters." As Grant's breathing slowed and his forehands relaxed, Kalen felt a familiar golden warmth entering the room. He didn't have to look to know it was Syra. Princess Syra walked into the lab, her silver hair flowing freely, no longer bound by the rigid braids of her station. She was carrying 2 cups of hot lavender tea. She didn't announce herself with a fanfare. She just smiled at the cadets and handed a cup to Kalen. "Class dismissed for the afternoon?" she asked, her emerald eyes sparkling. 10 minutes early," Kalen replied, taking the tea. "They're making progress, Syra. Grant found his anchor today." Syra looked at the young Thraxian, who was now chatting excitedly with the other human cadets. "You're building an army of ghosts, Kalen." "No," Kalen said, looking at his students. "I'm building a bridge." They walked out of the lab and toward the observation deck, their strides perfectly matched. The synaptic lattice was still active between them, but it was no longer a tool for war. It was a shared language, a constant, low-level hum of affection and understanding that made the station feel like home. As they reached the panoramic window, they saw a massive Lunari cruiser docked at the central ring. It was the Morning Star, the flagship of the Royal Fleet. Today was the day they were to leave for Lunaris Prime to oversee the final ratification of the Suture Accords, a treaty that would ensure all neural bond research was made public and non-lethal. "Are you ready for the high side?" Syra asked, leaning against the railing. "My father has invited 300 dignitaries to the gala. They'll all want to hear the story of the human who stitched the stars." Kalen looked out at the silver scar in space. It was almost invisible now, a faint shimmer that only appeared when the light hit it just right. "I'm ready, as long as I don't have to wear a cape." "I make no promises," Syra laughed. Kalen turned away from the stars and looked at the bustling atrium below. He saw Mentor Zektor talking to a group of new instructors. He saw Varkas Krell showing a human cadet how to properly calibrate a kinetic gauntlet. The station was alive, not with the predatory energy of the past, but with the messy, complicated, beautiful noise of 1,000 species trying to figure out how to live together. He thought back to the boy he had been 3 months ago. The boy who sat in the shadows of the back row, hoping to be invisible. He remembered the weight of the silence, the way he had thought of himself as a broken tool, a liability that the universe had forgotten to scrap. He realized now that he had been wrong about everything. The silence hadn't been a wall, it had been an invitation. His mutation wasn't a curse, it was a unique way of seeing the beauty in the chaos. And his survival wasn't an accident, it was a choice he had made every single day, even when he didn't realize it. Kalen took a sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was standing in the center of the world, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to run. I used to think that to be brave, I had to be like the people in the stories, Kalen thought, his reflection passage beginning to take shape in his mind. I thought I had to be a warrior who didn't feel fear, or a leader who always knew the right path. I spent 20 years trying to be a stone, hard and cold and immovable, thinking that was the only way to survive the noise of a breaking universe. I thought my silence was a prison I had built to keep the world out. But Cyrus showed me that it was actually a house I had built to keep myself safe until I was ready to step outside. I look back at the boy in the back row and I realized that he wasn't weak because he felt the pain of the void. He was strong because he carried it for so long without letting it turn him into a monster. We are all sutures in a way, aren't we? We are all born into a world that is loud and chaotic and sometimes very, very cold. We all have these jagged tears in our history, these wounds that we try to hide under our armor or our titles. But the lesson of the ether spire isn't that we should close our eyes to the darkness. It's that we should hold each other's hands while we walk through it. My silence is no longer a void. It is a space where I can finally hear the truth. And the truth is that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else, someone else, is more important than that fear. Kalen looked at Syra, who was watching him with a look of profound, quiet love. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers weaving through hers. Syra, Kalen asked. Yes, Kalen? When we get to Lunaris, do they have a back row in the ballroom? Syra smiled, her emerald eyes glowing. For us, Kalen, we're going to be right in the middle of the floor, and we're going to dance. Kalen laughed, a sound that was full of a light he had never known before. Solid. He turned back to the window watching the stars. The universe was still loud, still chaotic, still full of mysteries and dangers. But as he stood there with his partner, he felt a question forming in his mind. A question for every soul who had ever felt small against the vastness of the dark. I spent my whole life thinking the silence was a cage, only to find out it was the foundation for everything I was meant to become. I wonder, what is that one part of yourself you've been trying to hide because you think it makes you weak? What if that very thing is actually the key to saving your world? If only you were brave enough to let someone else see it. Kalen squeezed Syra's hand, and together they walked toward the docking bay. The ghost in the machine was gone, replaced by a man who was ready to be heard. The silver scar of the rift had vanished, replaced by the steady golden light of a new day. Kalen Voss didn't look back. He simply stepped into the light, and for the first time, he didn't mind the noise at all.